The moon, looking a trifle faded, was just above the western hills when I started up out of my sleep as if I had heard a sudden noise, but all was still as the grave. For several seconds I wondered what had awakened me, then I recollected my whereabouts, and, missing the sound of the stream, knew that its sudden stoppage had served the purpose of an alarm clock. My first thought was to make sure that it had only just stopped, and I soon settled this, for when I hurried to inspect the channel I found that the water was still trickling slightly from one pool to another before ceasing entirely. Now was my chance. I obliterated all the signs of my camp as far as was possible, and, stowing my rifle and ammunition in a safe place, hurried along the bank towards the deep pool. Scarcely had I reached the last group of bushes, however, when I had cause to start back and hide myself. There was someone climbing out of the empty pool. Peering through the branches, I saw Ngaraki raise himself to the bank. He had a large Maori kit in his hand, and with this he walked along the bank towards me. The light was dim, and I crouched among the bushes while he passed by within several feet of where I stood. He was evidently going to fill the kit with kamaras and fruit, and take it within the mountain again. Why was this lordly chief, whose back was tapu, playing the part of a slave, if not for the same reasons that had actuated Te Makawawa before him, to serve the woman with the stars in her eyes? I saw my best chance was to enter at once. Accordingly, as soon as Ngaraki was out of immediate earshot, I slipped from my concealment, and, climbing cautiously down the bank, dropped onto the shingly bed of the stream. Before me in the wall of the rock, its lower lip level with the bottom of the channel, was the now vacant aperture, between 6 and 7 feet in diameter, and beyond this was the inky blackness of the cavern within. I entered the gloomy place, and felt slight gusts of wind upon my face. Advancing a pace or two on the hard, smooth, rocky floor within, I looked about me. At first I could see nothing, but presently my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, and I found that the cavern, for such it was not as dark as I had thought. I could discern great spaces, with vast shadows beyond them. Immediately before me, some 10 paces away, was visible the dim outline of a colossal rock, smooth and rounded. From this a tremendous spar sloped upwards towards the further wall of the cavern. But these things were towering above me, and I could get but the vaguest idea of their outline. I now felt at a loss to know which way to proceed, and, fearing that at any moment Ngaraki might return, or that a torrent of water might spring up out of the darkness and wash me out of the mountain like a bruised rat out of a hole, I made up my mind to risk lighting a match to see if I could find the source of the stream. I advanced further into the cavern, testing every footstep, then, striking a match, I held it up and took a hurried glance round. The floor, worn smooth by the action of water, sloped up to a huge basin-shaped rock about 5 yards in advance of where I stood, and from the lower part of this rock I caught sight of water trickling as if from a crevice. Quickly I ran towards this and examined it. In the lower part of the side of the great vessel was an aperture 5 or 6 feet in diameter, which appeared to be stopped up by a rock fitting the inner edge so neatly that there was hardly a crevice except that through which trickled the small escape which had attracted my notice. I could hear the sound of waves lapping against the rocks above me, and concluded that there was a large body of water in some reservoir there. I immediately set to work to find a way up the sheer wall which, with the great basin, enclosed the space where I stood, making a kind of rugged courtyard some 10 or 12 yards square. The wall which ran round this space joined with the wall of the cavern on each side of the aperture by which I had entered, and also with the basin on each side of the orifice which was stopped by the stone, leaving just enough of its curved contour to suggest the idea that it was a basin. It was quite 20 feet high, and at the top there appeared to run a platform. It was this that I set myself to reach. A hasty search of the water-worn wall all round, by the light of a match, revealed, on the left hand as I faced the entrance, a series of holes in the rock, evidently designed as a ladder. Up these I made my way and scrambled on to the platform above. Here a strange and wonderful scene lay spread out before me in a dim, misty light, a scene whose details appeared indeed to be the handiwork of some giant race. The vast cavern itself was apparently the work of some disruptive agency, but it was simpler to believe that the objects which it contained had been fashioned with human purpose and design, than that they were the slow work of natural forces during the lapse of ages. Before me, and occupying the whole of the cavern to my right, stretched a large lake, with its water seething as if in a boiling cauldron. Flung up in a tumult from below, with huge bubbles bursting on the surface, it rolled outwards to the almost circular margin, and lapped against the platform on which I was standing. Beyond the foam and turmoil of this lake was dimly visible the further bank, and above that rose the craggy sides of the cavern, arching up far overhead into the darkness. At a glance I saw how the place was lighted. Towards the left, at the end of a gradually narrowing prolongation of the cavern, running off obliquely from some outstanding crags straight across the lake, I could see an opening, with huge perpendicular bars like the irons of a grating. Through this colossal window, which opened on the other side of the mountain wall, the rosy dawn was sending its first messengers into the gloomy place, shedding a soft, diffused glow, in which everything found a spectral outline. The topography of this vast cavern was so remarkable and awe-inspiring that I must describe it here in detail, though briefly. The huge rock which I had seen from below I now made out to be a bowl-shaped receptacle some 30 feet in diameter, filled with water from the lake by means of a narrow channel, so that the flat surface which led round the top of the basin was continuous with the rim of the lake. It seemed possible, by means of this continuous and level pathway, to walk round the top of the basin and strike right across to the other side of the cavern, upon a narrow partition that separated the lake on the right from a profound abyss on the left, an abyss which I saw occupied the whole of the remaining part of the place, including the gulf with the giant's window at its far end. It would have been possible to get across the cavern in this way, had it not been for a gap in the partition, through which the overflow of the lake rolled into the depths below. Upon the further lip of the basin which faced the abyss rested a gigantic spar of granite, the long tapering point of which sloped upwards for some 50 yards towards the further roof of the cavern, while its more compact and weighty end lay beneath the water in the huge vessel. It was evidently the head of this long spar which now blocked the hole in the bottom and prevented the water from escaping. As I was gazing in wonder at these extraordinary stones, I was aroused by the sound of a footstep crunching on the shingle at the entrance below. It was Ngaraki coming back. My first impulse was to plunge into the water and hold on to the rim of the lake, and so conceal myself, but, thinking there might be some recess near at hand, I glanced along the wall of the cavern to my right, and, seeing a spot nearly halfway round where the rock seemed to be a shade darker than the general gloom, I made towards it along the narrow margin of the lake. When I reached it I found that it was a little recess stocked with what appeared, by the feel of them, to be pieces of the resinous remohart which the Maoris use for torches. I could not stay there, as no doubt Ngaraki would want a torch, and would come to the recess to get one. Getting a trifle flurried, I continued my way round to the other side of the lake. There was less light here, owing to the buttress of crags round which the light from the grating came but faintly, and consequently I ran less risk of being seen. But if I was to learn anything of the secrets of the place and of Miriam Gray, as well as avoid an unnecessary conflict with Ngaraki, I must hide, and that quickly, for now I saw the dim form of the Tohunga moving on the other side. He was carrying something, probably the kit full of provisions, along the margin of the lake towards the recess where I knew the torches were stored. All this while I was groping among the rocks for some place of concealment. At length I found a rock about 3 parts of the way round, which stood out a little way from the cavern side, offering a very narrow passage between itself and the main rock. Slipping behind this, I felt comparatively safe, and stood there awaiting events. A glance round my barrier showed the shadowy form of the Tohunga busy with something halfway round the lake. It appeared to me as if he was hanging the basket to a peg on the wall of the cavern, for when he stood away it remained there. Then he disappeared in the dark recess, and I conjectured he was going to light a torch. But no, he reappeared almost immediately with his kaitaka, which he wrapped about him after the fashion of a Roman toga, and sat down on the margin of the lake. Apparently he was waiting for something. The morning light now streamed brighter round the bend of the wall, and I could see more clearly the great spar sloping upwards to the roof above. A little beyond my place of concealment was a broad space of rock, where the partition that held the water up out of the abyss met the rim of the lake on my side of the cavern. Keeping close in the dark shadow of the crags, I ventured to approach this ledge. A feeling of awe crept over me as I peered into what seemed to be a vast bottomless pit, black, profound, and impenetrable. The overflow of the lake rushing through the gap in the partition made a faint swishing, hurtling sound as it poured down into the darkness, but no roar as of falling water came up from below. This fact appalled me. Was there, then, no bottom to that awful abyss? Above the dark, 40 feet or more from where I crouched, hung the gigantic spar, tapering upwards until its point almost touched the top of the overhanging crags against the roof. It presented the appearance of a mighty lever, the fulcrum of which was the lip of the basin on the other side of the abyss. A faint glow now struck across past the craggy buttress which at present concealed the gulf from my view. It hung above the pit and fell upon the wall of the cavern high on the other side of the lake. It was the first red ray of the rising sun coming in through the giant's window at the end of the gulf. It was this for which Ngaraki had been waiting, for, with one eye always on him sitting there, I saw him get up and replace his garment in the recess. Now he was coming round the lake towards me, and I hurried back to my hiding place. He passed on the other side of the rock, which I carefully kept well between us, and proceeded to climb the crags of the buttress. While I stood wondering what he was going to do, the red glow deepened, glinting on the long arm of the spar, and falling on the waters of the lake with a vivid emerald. The deep, high reaches of the cavern wall showed up in russet light and dark shadow, but most strange and terrible of all was the lowest shaft, which cut sheer through the inky blackness of the abyss, and fell upon its steep, smooth wall some 30 feet below the basin, showing the downpouring overflow of the lake like a flying greenstone arch. The light increased, and small clouds of mist rising out of the abyss threw fleeting rainbows upon the sides of the basin, upon the under surface of the long spar, and into the vaulted arches of the vast granite walls. It was with a hasty glance round that I noted these strange effects, for all the while I was intent upon Ngaraki's doings. He had climbed up the rocks, and was now standing erect upon a narrow ledge high up, almost on a level with the point in space where the spar's jagged and flinty-looking sides tapered off to a fine point. Looking more closely, I saw that to the extreme end of the spar was lashed a wooden sprit, which reached a point on a level with Ngaraki's shoulders, and about 6 feet from him. I stood and gripped the rock with nervous hands, as it slowly dawned upon me what the Maori was going to do. Surely he was mad. None but a maniac would take such a leap as that. The sunlight streamed past a corner of the cavern wall beyond, and tipped the end of the spar with light. The wooden sprit attached now showed clear and well defined. This was evidently what he was waiting for. Gathering himself together, he took the daring leap without the slightest hesitation, and in another moment his long figure was suspended above the dark abyss. It was with difficulty that I suppressed a cry at witnessing this, but what followed took my breath away altogether. The long arm began gradually to swing downwards through space, descending towards the abyss. Slowly and ponderously the great spar moved until its point, with the depending figure of the Maori, passed out of the line of sunlight into the gloom cast by the overhanging crags. Leaning forward, I strained my eyes towards the dark, moving mass. Surely he was not going to descend into the abyss. No, he evidently knew what he was doing. His feet touched a broad ledge of rock a few yards on this side the buttress, and his body straightened as if for an effort. The sprit descended upon his shoulder. It bent beneath the weight of the spar, which quivered at the shock, but the downward course of the lever was arrested, and, as he stood aside leaving it suspended there balanced by its own weight, my eye ran along its whole length, and the cause of this strange equilibrium was at once apparent. A huge round stone of many tons in weight rested in a hollow of the spar just above the basin's rim. The working of the thing was simple, and could be seen at a glance. The part of the lever in the basin contained a large hollow, into which the round stone rolled when the arm was raised, thus forcing the lower part of the head of the spar against the aperture at the bottom of the basin, and stopping the flow of the water. When, on the other hand, the arm was lowered, as had just been effected by the Maori, the stone rolled up from the hollow and settled in a groove immediately above the fulcrum, thus maintaining the whole spar in a state of equipoise. So neatly balanced it was that when Ngaraki let go and stood away, it remained stationary, quivering throughout its whole length, as the rolling stone oscillated for a few moments in its socket. In the very center of the arm that stretched across the abyss was a narrow constriction. So thin was the rock at this point that it offered an explanation of the artifice of the supple sprit at the end, and also of the Maori's action in steadying the spar before standing aside, for it was evident that if it were brought to a standstill by a sudden impact against the rocky ledge, there was danger of a breakage at the constricted point, in which case the whole thing, rolling stone and all, would go hurtling down into the abyss below. As my eye fell on the gap in the partition, I noticed that there was a change in the overflowing torrent. It was reduced to half its bulk. This was the work of the stupendous lever. Its head, rising out of the aperture in the basin, had liberated the water, which was now escaping through the hole in the mountainside, and, thus relieved of half its flood, the torrent which poured down into the abyss was diminished accordingly. Strange thoughts flashed through my mind in the few seconds that had passed since the descent of the spar. Was this the work of some race of giants, long since dead and gone? Who had hewn that round stone out of the solid granite? What giant hand had shaped that colossal bowl and balanced the long spar so neatly on its lip? For answer I considered two things. First, the saying of Tamakawawa that the giant sorcerers of old had fashioned a false image of Hinori as a long spar in the lower parts of the temple, and had bound it down with a great round stone, and, second, that science would call these things freaks of nature, formed by the age-long action of water. Between these two things I was unable to choose, for they flashed through my mind just as Ngaraki was coming along the edge of the abyss towards me. There was now considerable danger that I should be seen, for it was fairly light, even in the shadow of the crags. However, the spot behind the rock was dark enough, and I crouched there thinking he would pass, but what was my dismay to hear the sound of his footsteps coming round my barrier. He stood still. Surely he had seen me. I was preparing for a struggle, to be concluded either beneath the water of the lake or in the depths of the abyss, when I heard the Maori climbing up the rock above me. There was dead silence for nearly a minute. The water in the lake hissed and boiled, and the torrent of the abyss whiffled down into the darkness, but, beyond that, there was no sound, for the roaring of the escape through the mountainside had ceased, by which I knew that the waters had risen above the aperture, and the current was flowing silently beneath. Suddenly I heard a forcible exclamation from the rock above me, and, a moment later, the sound of a plunge. Darting from my hiding place I saw, by the commotion on the surface, where the Maori had gone down into the bubbling depths. With one hand on my sheltering rock to help me back into the shadows when he rose to the surface, I stood on the rim of the lake and watched the unfolding waters. Something strange was taking place beneath there, for the lake was now twisting and whirling as if a gigantic fish was turning round at the bottom. I was prepared for almost anything now, after witnessing the extraordinary evolutions of the spar, but still I must confess I was staggered at what took place. If anyone could have photographed me, then they would no doubt have secured a fine sample of a terror-stricken face, with gaping mouth and staring eyes. The boiling of the water ceased, and there, near the margin of the lake on the side opposite to the gap in the partition, a wave heaved up beneath the movement of something rising to the surface. A dark object reared its head out of the depths. At the same moment there was a hollow, booming sound overhead. Then, with a rush and a roar, from the side of the cavern some 40 feet above, issued a frothing cascade, which fell into the center of the lake with a sound like thunder, dashing the spray over my face and churning the water into tumultuous foam. The lower part of the cascade and the whole of the lake now gleamed like silver in the light of the rising sun. But the Maori had not risen to the surface. Had he perished down there? Or was this simply another lever contrivance beneath the water? Half a minute elapsed, during which I stood in utter astonishment watching the torrent, whose roar and tumult seemed to drown all thought and feeling. While engaged in collecting my scattered ideas, my eye caught a movement of some object ascending the wall of the cavern on the right of the cascade. I looked more closely. It was evidently the kit of provisions which I had seen Ngaraki attached to something there. That something I now knew to be a cord, but who could be drawing it up from above? Utterly at a loss, I could only conjecture that it was Ngaraki, who had passed by some more secret way of the fish beneath the lake, and had now reached a part of the cavern high above. Fearing that, if this was the case, he might see me, I withdrew further into the shadows. While I knew that this way of the winged fish was a passage which it would be worse than useless to attempt, for I now saw the truth of Taimakawawa's words to the effect that none could pass that way without being taught. I realized that my chances of reaching Miriam Gray without Taimakawawa's guidance were hopeless, and that I must turn my attention to the search for her daughter. Nevertheless, before leaving that strange place I was resolved to explore its accessible parts and see what hidden things of forgotten time it might contain.